everybody. I'm Lauren Borchard, Director of Historical Programs at the U.S. Capitol Historical Society. We're so pleased to welcome you to yet another edition of Lunch Bites with Steve and Jane. They'll be speaking today about a different intersection on Capitol Hill, so we'll dive into the history of the intersection that has actually disappeared. It doesn't exist now, so Steve will tell us all about that shortly. I'll turn it over now to Jane Campbell, the President and CEO of the U.S. Capitol Historical Society.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And I really appreciate the work you do behind the scenes to make these virtual learning opportunities possible. We have really enjoyed at the Capitol Historical Society figuring out ways to bring our programming directly to those of you who are staying at home and staying safe. I just want to make sure that you know that these are free opportunities, and we are grateful for your time and your attention. We're also grateful for those of you who share these opportunities with others. Yesterday we had a scholar series and found that one of our attendees had shared it with an association that they were involved in that was focused on African American history. And so we had a whole group of people that had not been part of our audience before, and we were delighted to have them. So we invite you to share the invitations with those who you think may be interested as they are trying to find ways to stay connected to the Capitol during these challenging times. I also want to thank each of you who are members of the Capitol Historical Society for your support, because it is only the generous support of our members and our donors that allows us to do our work. And those of you who've not yet joined, no opportunity like the present to join and come on and be part of the effort. Today we're going to take another tour around the Capitol and talk about the development of the Capitol grounds. Today's lunch bite with Steve and Jane is going to talk about the intersection that is now gone. But for those of you who don't know, Steve Livengood is a precious resource for the Capitol Historical Society. Steve has been doing tours of the Capitol and the Capitol grounds for 50 years. He knows every inch of the Capitol, every story that you can imagine. He can regale you with ghost stories and the people who made the Capitol alive. And so I invite you to, as he's talking, think about questions. I have pulled from all the questions that we've done over the last several series, some of the things that we didn't talk about. So I'm going to pull those questions, but absolutely we invite you to participate as we get engaged. So that being said, our most precious resource, Steve Livengood, take it away.
Thank you. Let me see how I share my screen here. Okay, today we are going to talk about the intersection of Delaware Avenue and A Street Northeast, the block that disappeared. And much of what I'm going to talk about comes from our book that I've displayed the cover here called Creating Capitol Hill, Places, Proprietors, and People. We published a couple of years ago about the neighborhood. So we're going to start with the L'Enfant map, which is, of course, the origin of Washington, D.C. And I put this arrow on the block. We'll see in a moment that is called Square 687. And we're going to talk about what happened on that. This is L'Enfant's map, and you can see that this block faced right on the Capitol grounds there. This is the situation in 1801. And you can see the lower blue arrow there is pointing to a building, but the arrow up above is pointing to the end of Delaware Avenue. And Delaware Avenue then goes at an angle down to the Capitol grounds and stops there. But you can see it sort of jogs and crosses Constitution Avenue, where I've put my little red dot there. We don't know whether that actually had a street name or not. They weren't very clear about things like that. But the street went on to what is now the Capitol grounds and created a block here. I'm going to go around it. I just learned about using my cursor today, and so I'm just getting used to it. As you can see, this is First Street here that exists today, and it goes right straight up, but it didn't at that time. The streets hadn't been cut. And let me repeat that there were no paved streets at that point. They did pave Pennsylvania Avenue from the White House to the Capitol, but none of the rest of the streets in the city were paved, even by the time of the Civil War. They would be maintained. They would be gravel or stone or something, but they were not formally paved, and there were not formal edges on them. But this, you can see this block exists and has several buildings on it. This block was special because it was the one that Daniel Carroll chose to make his own. He had the right to claim half of the lots in the area that he had previously owned, and this is one where he claimed all of the lots on this and exchanged them for the opposite block, which I'm going to show you now down here. You can see there's another block that's cut into the Capitol grounds, and he gave up all of his lots in that square in order to claim all of them in this square, and this is where he wanted to build his most important property at that point. It was called Carroll's Tavern, and it was, for a while, he started in 1805, and for a while it was the best hotel, restaurant, bar on Capitol Hill. He decided that he needed other partners on it. He didn't want to do it on his own, and so he donated the land to the partnership, but he got all of the major players in Capitol Hill real estate to go in with him on this tavern, most likely because he wanted to make sure that they were dedicated to its success and didn't put up competing properties. So he's got Thomas Law involved. Thomas Law is the man who came from India with a British man who had been in India, made a fortune, and brought his money here to Washington to help develop the city. And he invested all over the United States, but he's particularly interested in Capitol Hill. He had married Martha Washington's granddaughter, so he wanted to establish himself here. Daniel Brent was Carroll's nephew, and he's involved. George Blagden, who was a developer and part of the bank, and he had designed and built George Washington's houses that we'll talk about later. He helped design and build the canal and some of the churches here. So he's a major player. James Hoban is the architect of the White House, but he probably contributed the plan of this building as his contribution to ownership. So he's involved. He even at one point was supervising construction of the Capitol itself. Griffith Coombe, C-O-O-M-B-E, was an investor who took a lot of land on Capitol Hill and is quite involved with this particular location. And then Robert Brent, who was the mayor and a local financier and related to Daniel Carroll's mother. And he also happened to be the person who led his family in owning the quarry from which they were getting all of the sandstone to build the Capitol and the White House. So these are the people that were involved in the construction of this building. The next map is Latrobe's map from 1815. Now this is the map that they did after the British invasion to show what buildings were remaining. And so I've marked the blue arrow again to show you what square we're talking about. And this is the square itself. You can see it's marked 687. And if you read the words down there, it says ruins of the tavern. So what happened is that the British invaded on August the 24th, 1814, and they had pledged that they were not going to burn any private property. They were only going to burn government property. However, this tavern was so popular that it had been used as the muster point for the militia before they went out to attack the British on their way to Washington. And so when the British found out that this tavern had been used as a muster point, that makes it used for government purposes, and so they used that as their excuse to burn the whole thing. So that's what this is about. Carroll builds this wonderful tavern that's quite popular, and then the British come along in 1814 and burn it completely. I mentioned Griffith Coombe, and he then purchased the ruins and developed them. This is Latrobe's sketch from 1813, before the fire, of what he could see from his rooms. And we think he was staying somewhere around 7th Street and Pennsylvania Northwest. So on the left here, you can see he's called it Irish Town. These are small buildings that you can see very plainly. And then the tiny marking, move my cursor over here, this mark right here says Washington, and that would be an indication that that's where Washington's houses were, that he could see from there. So if you know that area around 7th and Pennsylvania, it's quite a ways, probably pretty close to a mile away, but this is what he could see. Over here, you've got the two sections of the Capitol. The center still wasn't built yet, but he's showing you where the Capitol is. But this building right here, there were two buildings that he probably could have seen, probably one in front of the other. It's possible that this building back here is the Capitol Hill Hotel, which was older, but not owned by Carroll. This would be the one we're talking about here, I think, although that's not settled definitely. These are poplar trees that were planted in the block in front of the Capitol. And then this building we can't identify. We don't know exactly what it is, but it would possibly be along Pennsylvania Avenue southeast. Over here, you can also see poplar trees. They had lined Pennsylvania Avenue with trees. Those are the only trees. These up here and the ones down below were the only trees that were deliberately planted by the government for the area. But this gives you an idea. What you're seeing along here is the path of Tiber Creek. So this is what it looked like from Latrobe's viewpoint, from his rooms that he had by 1813. Now here is the famous drawing of the Capitol in ruins, and this is from the other side, from the east side, looking back in the direction that the other drawing was from. So this shows the Capitol in ruins and what the situation is, and of course off to the right here would be this tavern, also in ruins. Now I want to go back to this point and talk about what happened. I said Griffith Coombe had purchased the ruins and put up buildings. There was a Capitol Hill boarding house keeper named Alfred Dowson, D-O-W-S-O-N, and he had been keeping, his mother actually had been keeping boarding houses starting in 1807 in some of Thomas Law's buildings over on New Jersey Avenue. The mother died, and Alfred carried on her business, but decided to move over to this block. And so Griffith Coombe put up two buildings for boarding houses for Alfred Dowson. And by 1807, he's got these two. One of them had could hold, these are for members of Congress, and he could hold 10 members in one of them and 14 in the other. By the time he died, he had 6 buildings along this way. He never married. He died in 1850, and he had some enslaved people, but he in his will he freed them and gave them as part of his estate. So he really valued these people very much, and he left the rest of his estate to create a fund for the poor people of the district and to give money to some of the churches on Capitol Hill. Dowson's Row was demolished in 1873, but when it was noted at the time that the buildings were still sound, so these were very good quality buildings that they put up, and Alfred Dowson kept them then for more than 40 years. This is what the front of the Capitol looked like by that point. By the point that I'm about to show you, which is this photograph, these 2 photographs. This is Lincoln's second inauguration. You might recognize the one on the left. Lincoln is in the center there, right about here. But the one on the right is looking back the other direction from Lincoln's viewpoint. And in the front, you can see some men lined up there, and they all have crutches. These are disabled veterans, men who have been wounded in battle, and they were given the front seats at Lincoln's second inauguration. I've just started reading the new book that came out about Lincoln's second inauguration, and he talks about the fact that people kind of considered it to be a miracle that Lincoln even won that election. And it was the soldiers voting that had a lot to do with his victory there. And so they are given the featured position there, and they all lined up. But in the back, those buildings that you see are the ones I'm talking about. That is Dowson's Row. Probably the lighter colored one along the left edge is the one that held 10 members of Congress. And the other one, the next one it's a little darker, probably red brick. Looks like it's one bay wider, or at least the bays are wider. And that one would have been the one that held 14 members of Congress, but then he owned more. The whole block was filled with these buildings, and Alfred Dowson had 6 of them as boarding houses by the time he died.
Steve,
This is what it looks like today. I've put yes. Okay.
Just before you go to the next, a couple more questions about the tavern itself. What the tavern, did the tavern have lodging as well as the rooming houses?
Yes. A tavern was more of a full service hotel by their definition. Yeah.
And did they have like live music and entertainment?
Some of the buildings had things like bowling alleys and horseshoes and so forth. I don't know about Dowson's, whether he did or not, but that would have been something that they would have done. Yes. But above all, they go ahead.
What above all they did booze?
Well, yeah, probably. But more important was lunch. They would eat together.
Okay.
At a boarding house, you would be committed to eating lunch there. At a tavern, it might be optional.
I see.
And you'd be eating with the same people every day.
Okay. And so you can see how the bonds got formed between the members of Congress and the folks who were there. One of the other questions.
Actually,
go ahead.
Yeah.
No,
I want to add about the boarding houses because it's important to know that the boarding house people tended to board with people they agreed with, and they were identified with which boarding house they were in, and that would give your political viewpoint. And so when Abraham Lincoln stayed at one of these, he did not stay at Dowson's, he stayed at another one, but he joined the anti-slavery boarding house. And so that's how we know how clearly he was identified with the anti-slavery, was by the boarding house that he chose. And Mary came with him the first time, and she stayed in that boarding house as well. And so that's an indication of where she stood on the issue of slavery as well.
And
go ahead, Jane.
Now we got some real basics here. People are trying to figure out what was a paved street in the pre-Civil War era. I mean, what we think of as paved street is probably different than what people thought of pre-Civil War. And you said there were paved streets, weren't paved streets. What does that mean?
The streets would be improved in that they would have gravel and so forth. But by paving, I'm referring to having curbs and some kind of a covering, petroleum-based covering. And the only one that was paved, even they would even put planks of wood across. And while a particular owner might put planks of wood in front of their property, the city did not pave streets. And above all, the edges of the property were not defined by a gutter or anything like that.
And were streets in other cities paved prior to the Civil War, or was it just a Washington thing?
It's a particular issue in Washington. I'm not sure the status. I'm sure they were paved in New York and Philadelphia. I don't know about Baltimore, but I would assume, my understanding is that most cities, Washington was much more pretentious for the numbers of its population than these other cities. And so while it was competing with them, Washington didn't have nearly as many people until the Civil War. And then at that point, we start putting in sewers and running water and all the other urban things that other cities had.
Got it. And then somebody has a real basic question. Did they really serve Sam Adams craft brews?
Did they? Oh, no, Sam Adams was not here.
It was just an imaginary.
Right, but there were lots of breweries in Washington. That was, in fact, a lot of these, the taverns and so forth might have made their own beer.
Oh, interesting. And these boarding houses look a little bit like houses you can see in Georgetown today. Were there boarding houses in Georgetown, or were they really focused on Capitol Hill?
They are particularly important on Capitol Hill because there were not other houses, and most of the houses in Capitol Hill were actually designed to be boarding houses because they knew there are going to be people coming in here who would not want to buy. So there would be some boarding houses in Georgetown, but they wouldn't be the focus the way they are. There are actually at least 2, maybe 4 remaining historic boarding houses on Capitol Hill. They're in Southeast behind the Library of Congress. Are a couple of really, really old buildings that were boarding houses that would have looked like the ones you can see in the photograph here. That is, they're flat fronts. They're not bay fronts, and they still exist. And I know one of them rents out rooms to the actors at the Folger.
Oh, fascinating. Well, this is, I love the depth of your knowledge and the depth of inquiry that our participants have. So take us back to the second inauguration. Is that the same inaugural pictures where you saw a picture of John Wilkes Booth attending that inauguration?
Yes, the previous one, the one on the left here, is the one that shows John Wilkes Booth. Somewhere along in here where I'm moving the little red dot is John, or actually he may have been up here on what they call the cheek of the steps, but they picked out a particular person in there that they think is John Wilkes Booth, and there is a record that he was there. But on the right here is what this is the same view today. From this, I stood up on the steps where Lincoln would have been, and this is what Lincoln would have seen, and you can see there's no Dowson's Row here. And the reason that they tore down that block is because of the extension of the Capitol grounds, and so that's why it disappears. I put the yellow arrow to show you where that block was, where A Street had cut through the Capitol grounds, but they have eliminated it as part of Olmsted's plan to give the more grounds surrounding the Capitol. They essentially extended the Capitol grounds another block all the way around. And then Olmsted creates this wonderful design that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. And so that's the reason why this was demolished in 1873. The Capitol, the center part of the building that you see here, and I'll move my little cursor over here, this part right here is what existed. And that's what was in the previous plans. And then on each side in the 1850s, they decided they needed bigger chambers, and so they put they built a new Senate chamber here and a new House chamber down here. And the streets had been actually right along the edge here. The previous street had gone on these two edges, and so that shows you how much they extended. They took in all of the grounds that existed, and so they needed a new buffer, and so they bought a whole block from B Street, which becomes Constitution Avenue on one side, down to B Street on the other side, which becomes Independence Avenue eventually. So they've extended all of this area along here is added to the Capitol grounds at this point, and they demolished this whole block of wonderful buildings in order to do that. So to give a few dates, they decided to have the extensions in 1850 and started the construction. And that's the point at which they decide to add the dome, which is located here. And one of the anomalies of this map is that they've mapped this extension on the front of the Capitol, and that doesn't exist. The dome was too far forward on the building, and so they planned an extension out here to balance the dome, but it was never built. But Olmsted had to account for it in his plan, and so actually the Capitol Plaza here is larger than what you see on this drawing even today. In 1855 is when they decided to add to the dome, and 1863 is when they finished the dome itself by placing the Statue of Freedom on top. And 1873 is when they decided to extend the grounds and hired Olmsted to do that. So they add a block on the north, east, and south, and then hire Olmsted to make this plan. They create this grand entrance to the building. There had been no entrance this way. The entrances were only here at the north and here at the south previously. And so they decide they want a grand entrance here, and so that's part of what Olmsted designed. Olmsted's plan is to put a kind of wilderness around the outside. You can see the trees are heavier around here and down here on the other side the same way, and then they get thinner and thinner as you go toward the Capitol building, and that's what he wanted to do. Now let's see what it looks like today. This photograph is taken from across Constitution Avenue. Looking back, you're looking right at where that tavern would have been, looking toward the Capitol building. These are a couple of pictures. The one on the left is taken from the Capitol side, looking back at diagonally across where Dowson's Row would have been. All of this area over here is where the Dowson's buildings were. The photograph on the right is taken from the far corner. On the left, it's taken from where the spot is here and looking back in this direction. So you're looking across this wonderful curved walk that Olmsted has, looking at what is this area right here is the open space that you see over on this side. But one interesting thing is that you're looking, now we're standing where that previous photograph was looking. You're looking back at the Russell office building, and this spot right here is where I had taken that previous photograph looking this way. So all of this area over here would have been Dowson's Row. And now the photograph on the right, I'm standing in the same place and looking toward the Capitol building. And one interesting thing that has developed there is this area right over here, which is referred to as the Senate Swamp. And we had a question about that the other day. You can see a cameraman here is setting up a camera right there for somebody to do some kind of broadcasting, probably a reporter in this case. But this is where you do press conferences today outside with the Capitol in the background. And this area was used for that purpose so commonly that they had compacted the soil. And so now they have to keep it paved because it was always damp, and they called it the swamp. But it's got paving along here. And then along the side here where the wall is, hidden behind the wall are the plugins that are designed for the various networks, and so they can plug their cameras right in there on a permanent basis without having to bring the remote broadcasting facilities onto the Capitol grounds. But sort of behind where I'm standing here is a parking space that says television only. And it's a special parking place that's maintained for these television remote broadcast trucks. So that is the story of the block that disappeared, the intersection Delaware and A that disappeared. Much of this is covered in the book that you see on the left, and you can get that from the U.S. Capitol Historical Society. And we encourage you to do that. I've got the web address there, and we have a lot of things for sale there. Jane, what other questions do we have?
Oh, we have a pile, Steve. Do you know when the Dowson buildings were demolished, was the owner compensated?
Oh, yes, I'm sure. Although government rules of compensation at that point were not nearly as generous as they are today. So probably the owners lost a lot of money on it. But the buildings would have been deteriorating by that point anyway, although they said they were really soundly constructed. But they probably, knowing that the buildings were going to be taken, they didn't maintain them. And Washington was a mess at the end of the Civil War. The population of the city had doubled suddenly, and there were hospitals and barracks everywhere, and nobody had been able to maintain their buildings through the war. So that's probably why there wasn't a lot of protest over taking that block.
And do you know when and where did Charles Wilkes live in this area?
Yes, Charles Wilkes lived in George Washington houses, which were on North Capitol Street. The houses that were in that drawing of Latrobe's, and we'll talk about that one of these days.
Stay tuned for the.
Yeah, it is extensive. Yeah, it is extensively covered in the book, in the Creating Capitol Hill book.
And another question back about the question about Georgetown. Was the development of Georgetown and the development of Capitol Hill, was that contemporaneous?
Well, Georgetown already existed. It was a town in Maryland, and it had been founded earlier as a river port. And so Georgetown was already developed. What happened was the competition was between the area on closest to Georgetown, but on the other side of Rock Creek, between there and the White House. And that area got developed first. there's a lot in the book about the problems that Daniel Carroll and Thomas Law had developing Capitol Hill because the development was going on so much more rapidly on the other end. And because the government was so limited at that point, that there were only so many surveyors available, and the land over by Georgetown was being surveyed first. And there are letters from Carroll and Thomas Law to the commissioners complaining about the fact that they couldn't get surveyors to even lay out the lots and the streets to show what they were selling because the development was going on so much more rapidly over by Georgetown. So it was a heavy competition between the two.
Interesting. Now, there was a Carroll Hotel that was down the street from Dirksen.
Yes.
The Dirksen Senate office building that lasted into the 60s.
Yes, it was here when I came to Washington. And so, in fact, this week I've been sending out emails to people to try to find what information I can about what was called the Carroll Arms Hotel. I have not been able to find out if there was any connection, ownership connection to the Carroll family, but certainly it was named for the proprietor and these other hotels that Daniel Carroll had built. We'll talk about the Carroll Arms Hotel and its notorious reputation in another session.
Oh, good. Gives us all a little tease. Remind us about the swamp. What kind of credential do you have to use to plug in your camera and your equipment? Do you have special credentials to swamp credentials?
Oh yes. All of this would be controlled by what's called the Senate Press Gallery, which is actually an organization of the people who of the press, and the Capitol is unusual in government legislative buildings around the world in that the press galleries are actually controlled by the press people, to the point that when Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid wanted to take over one of the rooms that belonged to the press gallery, the press refused to allow the Senate to have control of their own room, and got away with it. So it's a very powerful organization, and you have to have credentials, and the people who give you the credentials are the people who will be your colleagues. The press is the determinant of who is in the press.
Interesting. Now, you talked about Frederick Law Olmsted. Can you just kind of give that little perspective on, he had a great deal, he did work all over the country. What was his story?
It's really hard to summarize because he's just the most incredible character. Was involved in all sorts of things. There's a new book out now called Spying on the South, and the New York Times was a brand new newspaper at that point, paid him to go incognito through the South and try to determine what was going on in there in the late 1850s. And what he wrote from that two journeys that he took through the South became very important in people's understanding of what was going on in the South, because the people in the South were very secretive about their society, and particularly the economics. And his is the only economically based study of the South in that era. But he was involved with promoting scientific agriculture. The farm that he had was on Staten Island, and the house still exists, and the farm is there, although it's overgrown with trees now, but it belongs to the city of New York. It has not been developed, but he gets hooked up with the people who had the New York Times and the sort of intellectual leadership in New York City, and he's involved in agriculture, and so they hire him to organize the construction of Central Park. But they didn't have a design yet, and so he competed and won with a radical design of Central Park, and so he becomes famous for his design of Central Park. but then they had to suspend the construction of Central Park for the Civil War. But the same people who were behind Central Park wanted to make their contribution to the Army without and the war effort, but without sending their sons. And so they organized a group called the U.S. Sanitary Commission, the United States Sanitary Commission, to try to help the Army deal with the issue of illness and construction and sanitary construction of facilities. And so they hire Olmsted to run that, and he comes to Washington and lives here, and that organization eventually became the American Red Cross. But the Army took on a lot of the functions that he did. He exhausted himself in that, and so he went to California, and he's the first one that identified Yosemite as a place that ought to be preserved, and he really has a more powerful role in the creation of the National Park Service than did John Muir. So then he invents this thing called landscape architecture, which he's done really in Central Park and the Capitol, and they hire him to do the Capitol grounds. He has parks all over the country, thousands of them. Most major cities, particularly in the East, have a park system. Cleveland, Boston, Baltimore, Brooklyn wanted a park to compete with Central Park, so they had him design Prospect Park. Buffalo, he did a whole park system for them, and he invents this whole thing called landscape architecture, in which you don't focus on the individual plants as had been done in design before, when it was called landscape gardening. But he's not gardening, he's trying to do a painting. He's trying to do a landscape painting with real trees. And so that's the philosophy behind. So he's just this wonderful person and creates this whole concept because parks were going from being private to public at that point. Before Olmsted in the United States, and for the creation of Central Park, all parks were pretty much private. Where somebody would own it and allow people to use it. But the cities decided that parks are so involved with health that they should start doing it. And that started in England with Birkenhead Park outside Liverpool, which Olmsted went and saw, and then he comes back and does his plan for Central Park. And Central Park becomes the model for parks all over the United States. So you find Olmsted parks everywhere. And his firm continued into the 1960s, and then they donated all of their plans and papers and so forth to the National Park Service, and the Olmsted's headquarters, which was in Brookline outside Boston, is now a National Historic Site and has all of the photographs and the papers of the Olmsted organization and has published them.
Steve, there's one other question. In each of the intersections, as you're talking about the expansion of the Capitol complex, you sort of lightly referenced the Senate and House office buildings. Can you tell a little bit about the development of those?
Yes, the Capitol, of course, kept getting more and more full, and so by the time of the centennial of the city of Washington, it's obvious that the Congress needs their own office buildings. They had no staff. The members didn't automatically get staff. Only if you were the head of a committee did you get even an office. And the Capitol's too full, and so they decided every member should get some staff. And so they designed the two office buildings as part of the centennial replanning of Washington, in which the Olmsteds also had a major role. Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., who's known as Rick Olmsted, was the director, the major staff member of the commission that rebuilt Washington. And so they designed these two office buildings, the Cannon House office building and the Russell, that match each other. The Cannon was bigger. The Russell only had 3 sides on it at that point of the square, and the Cannon was a full square and had offices for every member. By that point, there are 435. And And the Cannon office building was the largest office building in the world when it was built. But of course, they quickly filled up and they got more staff members. Now each member gets 18 paid staff positions, although probably only about half of them would be here in Washington. The rest would be back in the district. But so that's 1909 when they moved into that pair of office buildings. And then little by little, they've added over the years. The House got a new office building in 1933. That's now called the Longworth Building. The Senate got us filled in the fourth side of their square, and then they needed an office building in 1958. It's when they moved into the one that's called the Dirksen Building. Then 1965, they move into the what's called the Rayburn House office building, the huge one. And then the Senate needed another one, and they built the Hart Building and moved into that in 1983. There are plans for more office buildings. They had a big revolt with the neighborhood, and they developed a master plan so that they promised not to go to the east of the Capitol. The Congress was actually buying up properties to the east of the Capitol in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, but the neighborhood got together and got the Congress to agree not to expand in that direction, but they will expand to the north and the south. And so they own the land behind each of those office buildings with the intent of building more. The assumption is eventually they will, but the Hart Building was the most expensive office building in the world at the time it was built. No surprise, of course. But they're taking a hiatus from that. But there are some plans, I'm sure, that they, with the intention of building even more.
Couple questions about with the boarding houses. Where did they get their water? Was there public fountains? Were there water pipes? Or how did that work? Do you know?
Yes, there would have been wells, private wells and public wells, but there was no running water, no piped water in Washington until the 1850s, and then they put running water all over Washington, water and sewers in the 1870s, and that's associated with the infamous Boss Shepherd, who did that. So that's all in the 1870s, but they would have used well water, and there were public wells and private wells.
And what about the enslaved people? Where did the enslaved people?
Dowson's Row, there were attics in all of those buildings, and that's where Dowson's enslaved people would have lived. Would be in the attics and the cellars. Those lots were small. Many of the lots on Capitol Hill were quite large, and they built buildings along the alleys that were used for animals and enslaved people. The Sewell House that we talked about last week, the extension in the back of the house there, which is right by the Hart Senate office building, the extension in the back there was for the enslaved people to work in the kitchen and live on the second floor in the attic of that extension. Then there were some private, some buildings built particularly for free African Americans, but for some enslaved ones as well. And we're actually going to talk about that next week, about some of those.
Boss Shepherd is really an interesting character. Was he involved in moving the streets around?
He was involved in leveling the streets, which you have to do if you're going to put sewers and water pipes in them. And so I showed what he did to the Duddington Mansion a couple of weeks ago in lowering the streets around it so that it stuck way up and was in many ways unusable. And he did that in defiance of the old property owners, and he ruined a whole lot of really good real estate, including Washington's houses and some others. In doing that, it was not done carefully. It wasn't an easy thing to do anyway, because the major mansions had been built up on the high points, and that's not compatible with installing sewers, and running water made it much more difficult. And so Shepard, the reason he was called boss is that he would actually not particularly consult with the landowners and come along and straighten out their streets, and leave their houses precariously up on very narrow and long staircases.
I think we're going to make this our last question, because we said we were going to be done in the hour, because we've got some more for next week, and we're going to keep this series going so you can continually be interested. We all have heard the story about Clara Barton started the Red Cross, but you talked about the United States Sanitary Commission. Was the Sanitary Commission the same organization that Clara Barton was associated with when she began the Red Cross near Clifton, Virginia during the Civil War?
Clara Barton's function was entirely different than the Sanitary Commission's. What she did was to help the soldiers stay in contact with their families, the wounded soldiers, and she had what was called the Missing Soldiers Bureau. It was very, very difficult to find where the soldiers had gone, what hospital they might be in, and so forth. The Army was not good at keeping track of that, and knowing whether somebody had been killed in the battle or not. And so this becomes very important, and Clara Barton is the one who stepped into that, and she took on that function. And then as the U.S. Sanitary Commission was dissolved, she took on some of their functions, but the Army took on many of their functions as well. So when I say it became the American Red Cross, some of the functions that they had are taken on by the Red Cross, which itself was Barton's organization.
Got it. Well, Steve, you are a wealth of knowledge, and I hope everybody will tune in next Thursday for the next intersection, which is the intersection of Delaware and Constitution, as we continue our journey around the Capitol and talk about creating the Capitol Hill neighborhood, and remind ourselves day in and day out that, in fact, the United States Capitol is the symbol of American democracy. It's the symbol of our ability to work through challenging issues and challenging times, and we certainly are living in challenging times. And the fact that we have found someone as knowledgeable as you, Steve, to tell us the history as we look at making history ourselves as we live through this pandemic, it is an opportunity for us to be reminded that, in fact, while our democracy is a bit messy, it is the way that we govern, and we're looking at nearly 250 years coming up, and we will continue our work at the Capitol Historical Society to provide civic education, which includes sharing our history, but also sharing the need for people to be engaged. That's why we do civic education with young people through our We the People Constitution Tour, and other activities. Again, we invite you to become a member of the Historical Society, to look at our website. There's lots of great tools on there for those of you who are homeschooling your children. So they're actually lessons for lifelong learners of all ages, and interesting merchandise that gives you a piece of the Capitol in your own hometown. You can see the image on the screen of the Statue of Freedom that Steve has talked about so eloquently, and that Felicia Bell talked about, that you could have that image in your own home. It's a perfect gift for someone who is a real patriot. So thank you very much. We look forward to our next adventure. Join us next week. Thank you, and thank you, Steve.